Sonkoba Vuba, translating strategy into operational reality, shares a passion for development of people, teams, and companies.
Get into it. So I think on this topic of revenue, I feel like what I find working with a lot of entrepreneurs is picking the revenue model or the options from the shopping list is the easier bit. What often happens is that there's insufficient testing of your revenue model to make sure that it's one that's scalable, but also one that's sustainable. So oftentimes I find people select a revenue model and it makes sense for the beginning of the business, but it also sometimes doesn't make sense for the growth of the business, or it doesn't help you grow. So you almost end up in this locked cycle where you actually can't grow beyond a certain point because you didn't pick the right revenue model or you didn't structure it correctly. So I want to focus on that because I think that that's where there's a gap in growth that we see with a lot of entrepreneurs, and I would like to not see entrepreneurs stuck in that. One of the key aspects of this is that you've got to build a business with scale in mind. If you're building a business today and I ask you, what is this business structure, the op model, the staffing, the operations, what does this business look like in 5 years from now? What does this business look like in 10 years from now? You need to have some sort of at scale picture of what your business looks like. And you need to be acutely aware of what the gap is between the today version of the business, which is the lean model of the business, versus what it's going to look like at scale. And I think that this notion of like the E-myth, which I found a really good one to coach entrepreneurs, which is when you look at your business through the eyes of scale, what is the gap? Because there is one. What is the absence of systems, the absence of revenue models that makes you scalable, and how do you gradually close that gap? Because if you don't, then you're not necessarily building a business for scale, and we need more businesses to scale. So what does that practically look like, and what are some of the pitfalls that you need to look out for? So the first one is you can come up with a number for your product and service, but the question is it enough revenue to make this a viable business? We've got lots of businesses that are out there that do make revenue. They're post revenue, they're not at zero, but they just never make enough revenue to cover not only expenses, but to cover and fund growth. Because I personally think funding is great, but the best funding is sales and revenue. So the question becomes, is there any other income or revenue that you haven't thought of? A lot of entrepreneurs leave money on the table. So if you're a platform business connecting two sides of a transaction and you're only charging one, why aren't you charging the other one? Is there a really good reason for that? Or is there potentially money you've left on the table? The other one is, it's all good and well to come up with pricing and understand what's competitive pricing, but the question of, will that price actually cover the cost that it's costing you to put that product into market? So the cost of sales. Do you have a deep understanding of your cost of sales to actually know for certain, hand on heart, that after you've got your sales or revenue and you take off your cost of sales, that there's actually going to be a gross profit? Most businesses operate on gross profit that's negligible, which means that there's very little revenue left available for operational expenses, which also means there's very little revenue left for growth. So the question is, what is that gross profit target? Do some research, into your industry and the places that you're working in. What is the industry going average for gross profit margins? In some businesses, it's as low as 2%, 3%, and in some businesses, it's as high as 70%. But you need to know what it is in your business, because that actually needs to feed into how you price your product or service and how, therefore, you make sure that you have sufficient revenue. The other, like I mentioned, was operating expenses. A lot of people at the beginning, you're doing a lot of things yourself as the entrepreneur, so it's free, right? In the future, it's not going to be free. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, as soon as they start scaling, hitting volumes, certain free costs that were being done by the entrepreneur or friends and family were being outsourced to do it, or travel that was being done by prayer suddenly gets priced in, and actually it sinks the business because the revenue model and the pricing model never actually considered that. And the big one, remember tax. Remember, you're going to pay tax. So in your pricing, in your thinking about operational expenses, think about tax. Yes, you may have a few years where you're non-profitable, but there will come a time where you need to pay tax, and that actually needs to be part of your model and part of your net profit margin target. So the other piece is just this importance of getting a sense of your real costs. And I think it was also mentioned earlier about how much is your customer willing to pay is very much correlated to their assessment of the value that your product or service provides them. You need to know what that answer is. And it's not necessarily just coming from you, but it's actually also coming from engaging with your potential target audience and getting a sense of what they are willing to pay and how you compare. Second overlay is that you need to get a good sense of what competitors are charging and how you compare there. Are you playing a price game where you're competing on price? Are you playing a value add game where you're actually giving more to them than what the current competitors provide, and therefore you can charge more? And the other one, which I think sometimes we take for granted, is try and make sure that you're operating in a growth industry. Try and make sure that you're building a business in an industry that will actually have likelihood to grow and actually have upside on revenue and growth potential. And when you're looking at that competitive advantage, which is that value that you add and create, which is actually what you're pricing for, look at ways to be more competitive or cut your costs to the bone. Look at what stuff could be automated and digitized. Look at where you can leverage technology. Look at how you can research customer insights. One of the things that we take for granted is just asking your target customer what their issue is and what they struggle with, and just responding to that actually produces a product or service that someone is willing to pay for. And a lot of entrepreneurs don't do that basic of actually giving a solution that solves for the customer's problem. A lot of us are trying to create a solution for a problem that they don't know they have, and there's a place for that. But at the bare minimum, make sure that you are actually responding to your target customer or target segments insights and information. And the other part that I think is important that I want to end on is actually quite similar to the point that we've just ended on when we talk about like VUCA, but also just, think how quickly things change. A lot of revenue models aren't scalable because people don't necessarily know what the economies of scale of their business will look like. So over time, and as your volumes increase, will there be an improvement in your unit costs of producing this product and therefore a higher margin? If you can't answer that, you need to get to an answer. The second is, what is your critical mass? Oftentimes when you start out, you're working at a loss, regardless of the pricing. And oftentimes as you get to a critical mass beyond that point, you'll be more profitable. But do you know what that critical mass is? Because that should actually be your target for sales, and when you know how long you need to suffer. A lot of people don't know the answer to that question. And be very careful of building a business where as your volumes increase, your expenses increase proportionally without the appropriate pricing model that takes that into consideration, because that will land you in a business where as you're growing and people are expecting you to become more profitable, you're actually becoming effectively more and more loss-making correlated to the volumes that you're working with. And like I mentioned, this whole thing about VUCA, the reality is everything is changing, and you can't build a business the same way that someone built a business in your industry 2 years ago, let alone 5-10 years ago. Your path to scale will also be very different. And there's certain principles that you need to understand. One is that things are constantly changing and we live in a VUCA world. The other is information effectively is accelerating the rate of change of everything. And information and data is more readily available today. And the companies that are surviving are companies that are awake to the fact that disruption is the norm. It's not going to change. They're the ones that realize that there's a drive to demonetization of things that we previously had money allocated to. So don't build a business on something that's going to be demonetized. Build a business where you realize that things are very variable. You can't necessarily always plan for 5 years. You've got to be flexible. You've got to be nimble. Customers are after trust and open, systems actually, and that's what they back. But also oftentimes smaller, nimble businesses are beating bigger businesses if you're able to build in a way that responds to the changes that we're seeing. So don't build a business that would have scaled today. Build a business that's going to scale in 5 years' time and into the future. And that requires you to understand what the underlying trends are, but also to make sure that you're coming up with a revenue and a pricing model that you can stress test, because the worst trap you can end up in is come up with some revenue for your business, but actually realize you've built a business that can never scale to a certain degree because you never stress tested your revenue model. So yeah, gonna leave it there. Thank you, Akobus.